Murmurs behind the door. The first thing Nightingale noticed was the gore. For a moment, she was brought back to the informant's house in Romstead and very nearly vomited all over again. The scene before them wasn't quite as bad, if only because it was a much larger space. Bits of flesh, bone, and clothing were pasted to the walls, floor, and ceiling. The traces of the original mine were barely visible. Minecart tracks leading through the cavern ended in rusted ruin as they neared a crater in the stone. There was no gore within this sunken area, no blood spatters like the ones further out. Only chalky gray rock, which crumbled away beneath Nightingale's fingers like dust. At the edge of the crater was a minecart, or half of one anyway. The side closest to the explosion had crumbled to nothing, and choking fingers of corrosion snaked out from the end. There were 3 bloody marks near the edge of the crater, and streaks leading away from 2. "You didn't use dynamite," Damocles muttered, kicking at the floor at the edge of the crater. "What the hell did you do?" Justice stopped just beside him, shivering as she took in the carnage. "They attacked me. They shouldn't have even been in Alinea, let alone down here. My guess is they were looking for the same thing we were." She paced around the edge of the crater, though she seemed to be searching the ground more than the crater itself. "So these people that attacked you, who were they?" Nightingale asked. It took Justice a moment to answer. "Grim Deacons. I heard them talking. I think their names were Echo, Valentine, and Quentin." "Wait, did you say Grim Deacons?" Rook sounded cautious. He was suddenly armed again, eyes scanning the cavern around them. "As in Brahma's elite group of spies and assassins?" "Yep," Justice said unapologetically. She dropped to her knees and began fishing around underneath some rubble. "I've heard about Grim Deacons." Damocles scratched at his chin in thought. "They're supposed to be elite killers for the aristocracies of Brahma. Hard to kill and incredibly connected. Why would they be here?" "They've been after my friend Zephyr for a long time," Justice nodded towards Nightingale while one hand still fished for something. "He's the one who can help you with the Malama. My Theodosian blast killed all but one when I used it. The one who survived the blast, he was the one with the blighted guardians. I don't think he was a Grim Deacon, though. He looked like a local, like someone from the city." She pointed suddenly at the other end of the room, where one patch of stone seemed more like a pile of rubble than a rock wall. After I killed the Grim Deacons, he ran through there." Justice finally found what she was looking for, working her fingers around a rock wedged against the wall. "This is what we were all looking for," Justice grunted, and the rock came loose. She lifted something from the ground, a fist-sized, irregular white stone. She jerked suddenly upward as Damocles snatched the item she had retrieved from her hand. He held it over his head, out of reach. "What is it that you and those Brahmanian spies wanted so badly?" he asked, staring at what appeared to be a normal stone. Justice turned, glaring up at him, but not jumping for it. "It's a pontifex, or at least part of one. I'm not entirely sure what it does, but my friend needs it." A sudden chill ran through Nightingale's spine. The voice hissed in her head. "You need it more." She didn't fight it this time, and instead crept around Damocles. He was too focused on the artifact to notice her. "Get it. These mines belong to the Hyde family," Damocles was saying. "That means that this artifact does as well. Maybe when we—" Nightingale leapt up, snatching the stone from his hand and landing a few steps away. Despite the cool cavern around them, it was quite warm to the touch, and much heavier than it looked, like white, translucent lead. Damocles turned an annoyed glance at Nightingale. "What the hell?" The room became deadly quiet, everyone frozen in place, all eyes on her. She straightened, holding the stone close to her chest with one hand. Her tail twitched behind her like an angry cat. "Your family rules Hyde, but Balthazar is king of Alinea. Until we're done, I'll hold on to this in my father's name." Damocles grunted and looked for a moment like he might draw his sword. Then he lowered his hand and turned away. "Fine." "But you don't need that," Justice pleaded. "My friend Zephyr does. When we get there, I can give it to him. Nightingale stashed the stone clear for all of them to see. Once it was in her pack, the strange warmth faded, and it became as cool as any other stone. Think of it as insurance. Zeke rested one hand gently on Justice's shoulder, looking around. No offense, but have you seen this place? Think of us holding on to the Pontifex as encouragement not to explode anything by accident. I like not being exploded, Remy added. We're wasting time. Damocles sounded sour again. Unless you'd like to lord over a minor house some more, Princess, we should continue our investigation. Yeah, Nightingale sighed. Sorry. Let's go. It took a little work to clear the exit. A few minutes spent passing rocks out of the way. Eventually new ones stopped rolling in to fill their place, and a worn tunnel appeared beyond, barely wide enough for Rook and low enough that several of them would have to stoop. Great. Damocles drew his weapon and took the lead into the dark. Let's find our assassin. The passage ended in a thick stone door. Damocles braced his shoulders against it and shoved with all his might. He grunted and groaned, but the door didn't budge. Rook joined in, but to no avail. Rook sighed, shaking his head. Feels like it's barred from the other side. I don't think we can force it open from here. I know one way. Damocles looked at Justice. Why don't you summon up another explosion? It worked on the rock back there. She shook her head, clutching at her book again. My magic isn't like what other mages do. Every spell has a price, and my tome expects to be repaid. Your book makes you pay if you cast a spell using it? Nightingale smiled, imagining what a book might want in return for a spell. Justice glanced at the tome with a worried look. Yes, exactly that. Not to mention the ceiling might cave in on us, Rook added. We don't have any idea how stable this passage is. Shh. Remy signaled to the door, then placed her ear to it. Someone's talking. Gage squirmed out of her pack and moved to leap to the ground. Before he could jump, Remy scooped him up into her arms, holding him there and looking down at him. Shh, she repeated. He glared up at her, wrapping his long tail around her arm. Damocles joined her by the door. Everyone held their breath. A female voice screamed through the thick door, just loud enough that Remy and Damocles could hear. This is your fault, Hendrix, her muffled voice shouted. We needed you to infect the Duke, but you couldn't even poison his damn air. Elias cries, buries his wife, and Hyde is still in Balthazar's hands. A male voice responded, no less energetically. We haven't failed. Just because Elias and Damocles aren't dead yet doesn't mean they won't be. Damocles stumbled backward away from the doorway. Remy glanced briefly back and saw his whole face had gone white. She mouthed the words, Who's that? But he didn't seem to notice. Justice slipped up from behind him and joined Remy at the door. The argument hadn't stopped. Elias doesn't have the stomach to kill his wife. When Rivka turns, he'll be the first one she infects. If we're lucky, it will spread to the whole household. Brahma couldn't hope for a better object lesson in the futility of Balthazar's rule. It will find Hydas City with not just a willing ruler, but a willing populace as well. The woman lowered her voice so that Remy could barely hear, but she could still hear the acid in her tone. Your lack of precision in the initial attack means we have to depend on luck for success. This is exactly the sort of weaknesses Brahma would not tolerate in a prospective ruler. There was a brief pause, then the female voice continued. We need another method. When the surgical strike fails, we turn to more destructive methods. Didn't you say the Hyde estate gets its water from the market well? We need not wait. We can strike the Hyde family before they recover and be more confident the infection will spread. If we can't pick off Elias individually, we wipe out the town. That will give way to Brahmanian occupation. Rook pulled Remy back from the door so fast that Gage squeaked and jumped away. She turned to him and was about to ask what he was thinking until she saw that everyone had backed up a ways. Justice had her book open. The pages didn't glow exactly, so much as they looked like they weren't even there. Instead of a book, Remy saw a door, and through it an ocean of cerulean and gold. Justice extended her other hand towards the wall, and it looked like she was screaming, although no sound came out. Suddenly the air rotted. Where the spell touched, stone withered. It was like watching 1,000 years pass before her eyes. Thick steel bands turned to rust, thickening and constricting. Stone cracked and buckled under the force before the metal turned to dust. Even though she hadn't taken a second breath, Remy felt as though she were watching the horrific scene in slow motion. Justice wasn't just ruining the stone. She was somehow killing a piece of the world. The passage in front of Justice widened dramatically, swallowing the doorway and the walls on the other side and leaving nothing recognizable behind. The timeless moment ended. Air exploded from the side of the impact, blasting dust past Remy and scattering equipment in the room beyond. Remy, with her light build and air-catching wings, was thrown backward into Rook, who caught her before she could be swept further down the cavern. Nightingale fared little better, smacking one of the walls so hard she fell over sideways and stayed there, stunned. Justice alone seemed as though she hadn't felt the explosion. For a moment she stood in the center of the maelstrom, ignoring the destruction all around her. Only when the dust had settled did she finally drop to her knees, breathing in gasps. Past the dust and debris, the room looked to Remy like a primitive laboratory. Near the entrance, delicate burners, tubes, and vials had been shattered or crumbled to ruin. Though further away, they'd only been thrown off the tables. Tables were packed with notes and books which had been scattered in the blast. Damocles recovered first, advancing past the fallen Justice and into the huge space. Remy followed, with Zeke not far behind. Never in her life had Remy seen such rage as she saw in Damocles. Damocles cleared tables and overturned shelves with a few confident leaps. He rammed into Hendrix just as he was climbing to unsteady feet, and took him straight to the ground. Damocles didn't even bother raising his weapon. Instead, he just slammed Hendrix into the ground over and over.
"We trusted you, you filthy bastard. Why would you betray my father?"
Remy spotted the woman she had heard earlier. She wore some sort of strange armored skirt and boots along with an assortment of ripped and tattered clothes. Her hair was swept back from the explosion, and her eyes were wild. She ran straight for the only other door in the chamber. Remy saw her go and moved to stop her. She ignored the brawl and dashed across the room, dust spraying from her wings. The other door looked much like the one they'd just destroyed, stone banded with steel. It had a large lock, and when the woman pushed, the door didn't budge.
"Hendrix, you damn fool!" she raged. "Why would you make an escape tunnel that needs a key?"
Remy approached cautiously, drawing her weapon. The woman turned, a sword in each hand. In her eyes, Remy saw a burning insanity. It was so intense that Remy paused. Perhaps it would be better not to fight this woman alone. Remy could see Damocles and Hendrix fighting behind her, but she didn't dare to steal a glance, lest the madwoman take the advantage.
"Elias is weak."
Hendrix shoved Damocles away.
"The Hyde cancer has infected us for too long. If it weren't for your family, Hyde would be a great city by now, part of a great empire."
Damocles kicked Hendrix's leg out from under him, then brought his elbow down on the fallen man's chest with all his weight.
"This is for my mother, you asshole. Even if I can't find a cure, I can at least bring her your head."
Nightingale finally entered the chaos-filled room, nursing bruises and clutching the piece of the pontifex close to her chest. Justice was close behind, her book still open in one arm and her eyes still a little glazed.
"Stop!"
Nightingale called. She held the pontifex piece out towards the woman. The woman stopped as she saw what Nightingale was holding, her eyes widening. Justice pointed at the woman in horror, struggling to speak.
I killed you. You should be dead."
"Be careful, Remy. That's one of the grim deacons." Remy was closing on the woman, who suddenly jerked, knocking over a table of beakers and bubbling liquids at Remy's feet before moving towards the fight in the center of the room. Remy jumped backwards in time to avoid the crashing table. At the same time the woman kicked the table over, she scooped up a nasty-looking syringe from the debris. She turned and made straight for the brawl. Remy noticed and tried to run after her, calling out to her friends.
"Zeke, watch out!"
Zeke looked in her direction and dodged out of the way just as the woman dashed past him. Damocles and Hendrix were too busy trying to kill each other to notice her. Hendrix had pinned Damocles to the ground and was raising a fist.
"Hendrix, your failure won't go unpunished.
the woman cried as she slammed the syringe straight down into Hendrix's back. "He's your problem now." She looked at everyone with a wild grin as she pulled a key from around Hendrix's neck, then sprinted for the door. Remy ran after her, dodging around Hendrix as she went. She took to the air. The low ceiling kept her from getting too far. By the time she made it to the door, the woman was already fleeing down the passage. The door was open just wide enough to permit her lithe form to slip through. Remy was ready to follow, but a hideous sound pulled her attention back to her friends. Hendrix was screaming so loudly that his voice gave out as he writhed in agony. Flecks of blood and spittle sprayed from his mouth. Even Damocles retreated in horror, staring. Hendrix's flesh went pale, pustulent blisters spreading across his body. His limbs stretched and grew inhumanly long, and bones snapped and splintered through his skin, becoming sharpened spines that oozed sickly green fluid. The blisters swelled as his torso and neck began to shrivel, as though he were a corpse hung upside down to rot in the sun. The ragged noises coming from Hendrix were no longer recognizably human. His eyes exploded with searing liquid, steaming as it splattered on the ground. Remy dodged around him, then caught Damocles by the arm and started dragging him away. She pulled him along towards the rest of her friends. The monstrous creature no longer resembled the man it had been. It clawed its way towards the back of the room, seeping vile fluid as it went. They could hear Hendrix as the last vestiges of his human mind struggled to preserve itself. "I will kill all of you." He gave a sob that turned to a grating laugh. "What the hell is that?" Remy spun with her weapon at the ready. "That grim deacon must have injected him with a pure concentrated form of the blight." Rook was glancing around the laboratory. It looked like the literature was all about the disease. Damocles gritted his teeth. It was clear that they could not let this abomination loose upon Hyde. They had to kill it here and now. "We have to kill this thing. Aid me, princess,"